The rhythmic thud of my boots against the cobblestones is the only sound that cuts through the rot and despair of the high market. I am a giant moving through a world of shadows, my 8-foot frame hunched beneath a frayed traveler's cloak to hide the crown I never asked for. I came here to lose myself in the crowd, but then I felt it, a golden thread of light, an invisible pull at my chest that nearly brought me to my knees. It led me to her. Eleanora. She is a ghost of a woman shivering in the freezing mud, clutching a tattered bundle against her chest as if she could shield it from fate itself. When she holds out a cracked silver locket, begging for the price of a single loaf of bread, I don't see a beggar, I see my destined mate, and I see the tiny, blue-tinged face of a child wheezing with the rattle of silver lung. I remember the reports of the Silverpine Pack's cruelty, of how Alpha Ignatius cast this widow into the slums while she was in labor, and a cold, primal fury settles in my marrow. I don't buy the locket. Instead, I drop a heavy bag of sun gold into the mud, a fortune for a life. I am buying the child's life, I growl, and he belongs to my keep now. As do you. Bringing these cinematic stories of justice and destiny to life takes our team weeks of dedicated work. If you find yourself rooting for Eleanora's survival, perhaps you'll join us by subscribing to see how her world shatters and rebuilds. The Obsidian Keep was a place of jagged stone and ancient silence, but tonight, the air inside was thick with the scent of burning cedar and the sharp, antiseptic bite of alchemy. Eleanora sat wrapped in a blanket of thick wolf fur, her eyes never leaving the massive silhouette of the man she knew only as the cloaked buyer from the market. He had shed his rags, revealing a chest like a mountain range and arms corded with the strength of 100 warriors. This was Thelonius Shadowforge, the High Alpha, the giant king, whose name was used to frighten disobedient pups. And he was currently holding her world in his hands. The heavy oak doors creaked open, admitting a man who seemed carved from the northern glaciers. Lucian Frostwalker moved with a clinical, cold precision, carrying a small obsidian veil that pulsed with a faint, internal amber light. Phoenix Ash, Lucian murmured, his voice as thin as a winter breeze. It is the only thing that can burn the silver lung out of his system. But you must understand, Eleanora, it is a fire. If his heart is too weak to sustain the spark, it will consume him from the inside. There is no middle ground. He will either wake as a warrior or sleep forever. Eleanora's breath hitched, a sob catching in her throat. She looked at her son, a tiny, pale bird lost in the vastness of the king's palm. He's all I have left. Please. Thelonius didn't look up, but his voice rumbled through the floorboards, a low bass that seemed to steady the very stones of the keep. He will not go into the dark alone, Lucian. Administer the ash. As the medicine was placed on the infant's tongue, a terrifying silence fell over the room. The baby's chest went still. The wheezing stopped. For a heartbeat that felt like an eternity, Eleanora was certain her son had been extinguished. Then, a tiny, violent shudder racked the small body. His skin began to glow with a feverish, golden heat. His temperature is dropping too fast, Lucian hissed, checking the child's pulse. The ash is fighting the rot, but his body is giving up. He needs a source of constant, primal heat. More than a hearth can provide. Without a word, Thelonius shifted. He didn't take his full Lycan form, there wasn't room for 12 feet of muscle and fur, but he allowed the primal heat of his alpha blood to rise to the surface. He sat back against the massive hearth, baring his chest, and tucked the infant into the hollow of his neck, covering the child with a hand that could have crushed a skull but instead moved with the delicacy of a butterfly's wing. For 72 hours, the king did not move. He became a living furnace, a statue of obsidian and fire. Eleanora watched from the shadows, her terror slowly melting into a confusing, profound awe. She had been taught that alphas were consumers, men like Ignatius who took what they wanted and discarded the rest. She watched as the most powerful man in the territories allowed his own vitality to be drained, hour by hour, to fuel the flickering flame of an Omega's child. On the second night, her voice finally broke the silence. Why? Why would the High Alpha suffer for a widow from the slums? Thelonius opened his eyes, the emerald depths glowing in the firelight. A king who only rules the strong is merely a butcher, Eleanora. A true alpha is a shield. Tell me, how did Ignatius justify this? How did he let a hero's son end up in the mud? The words spilled out of her then, a jagged, ugly history of the purity laws. She spoke of the night her husband's body was brought home, and how, before his blood was even dry on the floor, Brutus Worklaw had arrived with an eviction notice. She told him of Luna Cordelia's high-pitched laugh as she looked at Eleanora's pregnant belly and told her that defective stock had no place in a warrior's pack. Cordelia had taken her wedding heirlooms, her medicine, even her husband's journals, claiming they were property of the state. They called us a drain, Eleanora whispered, her hands shaking. They said my son was a waste of silverpine air. Thelonius's jaw tightened, a sound like grinding stone escaping his throat. Ignatius is a parasite masquerading as a wolf. He has mistaken cruelty for conviction. The morning of the third day arrived with a miracle. A sharp, healthy cry pierced the quiet of the chamber. The infant wasn't wheezing, his lungs were clear, his skin a healthy, vibrant pink. Thelonius let out a breath that sounded like a prayer, his massive shoulders finally slumping with exhaustion. He handed the squirming bundle back to Eleanora, and as their fingers brushed, a jolt of electricity, the pure, unadulterated power of the mate bond, raced up her arm. She recoiled, her heart racing. But the peace was short-lived. A horn blast echoed from the valley below, sharp and aggressive. A messenger bearing the silverpine crest stood at the iron gates, flanked by a dozen warriors. In the name of Alpha Ignatius Dark Moon, the messenger shouted, his voice amplified by a megaphone. We demand the return of the stolen property and the runaway widow. Surrender them now, or face the wrath of the Silverpine Legion. Eleanora felt the old coldness of the slums creeping back into her bones. She looked at the gates, then at the exhausted king who had just given his strength to her son. The tension in the keep snapped tight, guards moved to the battlements, and the smell of ozone filled the air as the obsidian keep prepared for a siege. Do you believe a leader should have the right to cast out the weak for the sake of the pack's strength, or is Ignatius a monster? Share your thoughts below. The heavy iron gates of the inner sanctum ground shut, sealing out the echoes of the Silverpine messenger's threats. Inside, the chamber was cast in the flickering orange glow of the hearth, but the atmosphere had shifted. The man who had spent 72 hours as a silent furnace stood to his full, terrifying height. He reached for a mantle of black wolfskin draped over a throne of obsidian, and as he fastened the silver clasp, a crest of a dragon entwined with a wolf, the truth hit Eleanora with the weight of a physical blow. You aren't just a lord, she whispered, clutching her son tighter to her chest. You are the High Alpha. The Shadowforge. I am the man who found you in the mud, Eleanora, Thelonius replied, his voice no longer a low rumble, but a command that resonated with the power of the United Territories. And in this keep, the laws of Ignatius Dark Moon hold no more weight than the ash in that fireplace. Eleanora felt a wave of vertigo. She had been hiding in the heart of the empire she was taught to fear. In the Silverpine Pack, they told stories of the giant king's ruthlessness, yet here he was, his emerald eyes watching her with a softness that felt like a secondary sun. I felt it the moment our hands touched in the market, Thelonius said, stepping closer, though he remained careful to keep a respectful distance. The thread that pulls at the marrow. The golden link that the stars forge once in 1,000 years. You are my mate, Eleanora. Not because I bought you, but because the universe recognized you as the other half of my soul before I even knew your name. Eleanora recoiled, her back hitting the cold stone wall. No. That's impossible. I am a widow. I am a failure. My husband was a warrior of the first rank, and I couldn't even save his journals from the fire. I couldn't protect his son from the slums. I am a broken thing, High Alpha. Your mate should be a queen, a warrior who stands 12 feet tall in her own right. Not a beggar who sold her heart for a loaf of bread. This was the shame barrier, the wall Ignatius had built inside her mind through months of systematic degradation. She saw herself through the lens of the purity laws, as defective stock, a drain on a great man's potential. You saved a life in a world that wanted it extinguished, Thelonius countered, his voice surging with a sudden, fierce heat. That is the greatest strength I have ever witnessed. You didn't fail your husband, Eleanora. He was failed by the very men who swore to bleed for him. As if summoned by the mention of betrayal, Lucian Frostwalker stepped back into the light. He held a small stone tray, and upon it sat a jagged, obsidian-black shard he had removed from the child's old swaddling clothes. I found this embedded in the fabric, Lucian said, his eyes hard. It's a black arrow tip. Rare, expensive, and exclusively forged by the Silverpine elite. It's tipped with wolfbane extract, a poison designed not to kill an enemy, but to paralyze a Lycan's healing factor so they bleed out from minor wounds. Eleanora's breath hitched. My husband, they said he was killed by a rogue from the Grimfong pack. They said he died a hero's death in a skirmish. A rogue doesn't carry a Silverpine black arrow, Thelonius hissed, the shadows in the room seemingly lengthening with his fury. Ignatius didn't just seize your home, Eleanora. He orchestrated your husband's death because he wanted the Silverpine borderlands, the land your family has held for generations. He turned a hero into a martyr so he could turn his widow into a pauper. The bombshell shattered what was left of Eleanora's world. The grief she had carried, the guilt that she hadn't been strong enough to help him, evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. Her husband hadn't fallen to an enemy. He had been executed by his brothers. Thelonius walked to a heavy iron chest and flipped the lid. Inside, thousands of sun-gold coins glimmered. Here is your choice, Eleanora. I refuse to be another master in your life. The mate bond is a gift, but I will not use it as a leash. If you want to leave, take this gold. I have a carriage waiting at the southern postern. It will take you to the neutral lands, far beyond the reach of Ignatius or the High Council. You can live in luxury, raise your son in peace, and never look at a wolf again. He stepped back, leaving the gold between them. Or, you stay. You claim your seat at my side. You help me tear down the corruption that turned your life into a tragedy. But know this, if you stay, we go to war. Eleanora looked at the gold. It was safety. It was the end of the hunger and the fear. Then, she looked down at her son. He was sleeping, his chest rising and falling in a steady, healthy rhythm for the first time in his life. He had his father's brow and his father's heart. If she ran, Ignatius would continue to hunt. He would find another widow, another defective child, another hero to sacrifice on the altar of his vanity. The awakening was not a roar, but a quiet, chilling stillness. Eleanora didn't reach for the gold. She reached for the black arrow shard on Lucian's tray, her fingers closing around the jagged edge until it drew a drop of her own blood. I have spent months being the prey, she said, her amber eyes locking onto Thelonius's with a fire that made even the giant king blink. I have run until my feet bled and I have hidden until I forgot my own name. But my son is a Silverpine. His father was a Silverpine. And I will not let a murderer sit on their throne while I hide in the neutral lands. She looked at the obsidian throne, then back to the High Alpha. I don't want the gold, Thelonius. I want his head. Thelonius let out a slow, predatory smile, a sound like a blade being drawn from a scabbard. Then we have work to do, my queen. If you were Eleanora, would you take the gold and run to safety, or stay and risk your life for revenge? Type run or revenge in the comments. The sky over the Shadowforge keep turned a bruised purple as the Silverpine war party crested the final ridge. At the center of the formation, Alpha Ignatius sat astride a massive charcoal stallion, his armor polished to a mirror sheen that mocked the grim reality of the slums he'd left behind. Beside him, Luna Cordelia looked on with a bored, aristocratic disdain, her furs worth more than the lives of a dozen widows. Thelonius. Ignatius's voice carried the amplified boom of alpha authority, echoing off the obsidian battlements. You harbor a thief and a piece of defective property. Surrender the woman and the bastard she sired with the enemy, or I will consider this keep a host to treason. Thelonius stepped onto the high balcony, his presence alone making the Silverpine horses rear in instinctive terror. He didn't wear a helmet, he didn't need one. His emerald eyes looked down at the riders like a god observing ants. The only treason I see, Ignatius, is a dog barking at a lion's gate, Thelonius rumbled. The woman is my guest. The child is under my protection. And if you call him a bastard once more, I will tear the tongue from your head before you can blink. Ignatius let out a sharp, mocking laugh. Protection? You've always had a soft spot for the broken, High Alpha. But even you cannot rewrite the laws of the first moon. She is Silverpine. Her husband died a traitor, and his spawn is a stain on our lineage. Hand over the brat so we can end its suffering properly. The heavy iron doors of the keep's main portcullis began to grind upward. The Silverpine warriors shifted, hands moving to their sword hilts, but the figure that emerged was not a squad of Shadowforge elites. It was Eleanora. She walked with a grace that silenced the wind. She wore a gown of deep emerald silk, her hair braided with silver wire, but it was her eyes that held the true power. She wasn't the skeletal ghost from the high market. She was a storm incarnate, her skin glowing with the vitality of the mate bond and the fire of a mother's vengeance. In her right hand, she held the obsidian black arrow shard, the sunlight catching its jagged, lethal edge. Ignatius recoiled slightly, his bravado flickering. Eleanora. You look, well for a beggar. I look like a woman who survived you, Ignatius, she said, her voice carrying across the courtyard with chilling precision. And I have brought something back from the grave. She walked toward the front line, stopping 10 paces from Brutus Warclaw. The massive enforcer looked down at her, his grip on his mace tightening until the metal groaned. He had been the one to push her into the rain, he had been the one to hear her screams in labor. But as he looked at the black arrow in her hand, his face went a sickly shade of gray. You told the pack my husband died in a skirmish with the Grim Fong, Eleanora said, holding the shard up for all to see. You told me he died a hero. But heroes aren't killed with Silverpine black arrows. They aren't paralyzed with wolfbane extract by their own brothers so they can be executed in the dark. She pointed the shard directly at Brutus's heart. You fired the shot, Brutus. I remember the scent of the oil you use on your bow. I remember the way you couldn't look me in the eye when you threw me out of my home. Was it worth it? Did the land Ignatius promised you sleep as well as my husband does in the dirt? Thelonius descended the stairs, standing behind Eleanora like a tectonic plate ready to shift. He didn't say a word, he simply placed a hand on her shoulder, his alpha aura flooding the courtyard, magnifying her words until they felt like physical blows. Brutus began to tremble. A psychological break is a terrible thing to witness in a man built for violence. His knees buckled, and he looked up at Thelonius, then back at the woman he had tried to erase. He said it was for the strength of the pack, Brutus whispered, his voice breaking. He said your husband was going to divide us. He was going to expose the theft. Eleanora roared. Ignatius, seeing his control slipping, let out a snarl of desperation. Enough. You've let a grieving widow poison your minds with fairy tales. He spurred his horse forward, his hands snapping out to strike Eleanora, a final attempt to reassert dominance through brute force. He never reached her. Thelonius didn't just move, he exploded. The shift was not a slow reshaping, but a violent, terrifying emergence of the primal. The High Alpha's clothes shredded as his frame expanded to a monstrous 12 feet of midnight black fur and corded muscle. His muzzle was a landscape of scars and white-hot rage, his claws the size of scythes. This was the Lycan king in his true form, a creature of myth that turned the air to ozone. Thelonius's roar was so powerful it shattered the glass in the keep's upper windows and sent Ignatius's horse screaming into the dirt. The High Alpha didn't kill him instantly. He pinned Ignatius to the ground with a single massive paw, the pressure enough to crack ribs but not crush the heart. Look at them, Thelonius's voice was a guttural growl that resonated in the very bones of the Silverpine warriors. Look at the weakness you tried to kill. Brutus Warclaw stood up, but he didn't raise his mace against the king. He turned toward Ignatius, his eyes burning with the clarity of the damned. No more, Brutus rasped. He looked at his fellow Silverpine warriors. We followed a murderer. We killed our brother for a liar. One by one, the Silverpine warriors dismounted. They didn't kneel to Ignatius, they turned their backs on him. The rebellion was silent and total. Cordelia tried to flee, but Lucian Frostwalker stepped from the shadows, blocking her path with a cold, knowing smile. By the laws of the High Council, Eleanora said, stepping over to where Ignatius lay whimpering beneath Thelonius's claw. You are stripped of your name. You are stripped of your blood. You wanted to discard the weak, Ignatius. Now you will know what it is to be nothing. Thelonius lifted the broken Alpha and tossed him toward the edge of the courtyard, where the abyss of the grey wastes waited, a desolate, magic-dead territory where rogues went to wither. Ignatius was dragged away in chains by his own former guards, his screams fading into the rising wind. Eleanora turned to Thelonius as he shifted back, his human form steam-hot and exhausted. He reached for her, and she didn't flinch. She stepped into his arms, the black arrow falling into the dirt, forgotten. The justice was done, but the world was only beginning to shatter and rebuild. The great council chamber of the Obsidian Keep was a cathedral of shadow and light, but today, the atmosphere was not one of intimidation. In the center of the room, atop the table where war maps usually lay, sat the wicker basket from the High Market. It had been scrubbed clean and lined with royal velvet, a humble artifact elevated to a sacred relic. Thelonius Shadowforge stood before the assembled alphas of the United Territories, his voice resonating with a power that shook the dust from the rafters. For centuries, we have judged our success by the sharpness of our claws and the size of our borders, he thundered, his hand resting briefly on the rim of the basket. We called it the law of the strong. But as I looked into this basket 3 months ago, I saw the truth. A pack that casts aside its widows and leaves its children to the rot is not a pack, it is a carcass. From this day forward, the strength of our empire will be measured by one metric: how we treat those who cannot fight for themselves. The room remained in a stunned, reverent silence as Eleanora stepped forward. She was a vision of reclaimed dignity, her eyes bright and clear, the last traces of the silver-lung shadows gone from her face. She knelt before Thelonius, not as a subject, but as a partner. Percival Ironcrest, acting as the high priest of the council, lowered the obsidian and emerald crown onto her brow. I present to you Eleanora, Luna of the United Territories, he announced. Her first act as queen was not one of vengeance, but of systemic change. She unrolled a heavy parchment, the Widow's Law. It struck down the purity laws of the old regime, establishing that the home and resources of a fallen warrior belonged to his family, protected by the crown. In the back of the hall, a murmur rose as 2 guards led in a woman dressed in the rough, grey wool of a kitchen thrall. It was Cordelia. Her former Luna rank had been stripped, her jewelry confiscated to fund a new infirmary in the Silverpine slums. She didn't look up, her hands red and chapped from the lie of the laundry vats. She was now a servant in the house of the woman she had called defective stock. There was no cruelty in Eleanora's gaze as she watched her, only the cold, hard justice of a world that had finally balanced its scales. The scene fades, the heavy stone walls of the keep melting into the vibrant greens and golds of a summer afternoon 3 years later. The Shadowforge gardens were an explosion of life. A young boy, no older than 3, sprinted across the grass, his laughter a silver bell ringing through the air. He had the thick, dark hair of his father and the stubborn, amber eyes of his mother. He was healthy, robust, and chasing a blue butterfly with a clumsy, joyful determination. Thelonius sat on a stone bench, his massive frame relaxed, watching the boy with an expression of pure, unadulterated awe. Eleanora leaned against his shoulder, her hand resting on his arm. The mate bond between them had matured into a steady, glowing warmth that anchored the entire kingdom. "He has your speed," Thelonius murmured, catching the boy as he stumbled and hoisting him into the air. The toddler shrieked with delight, tugging at the high alpha's beard with tiny, fearless hands. "And your temper," Eleanora joked, though her eyes were soft with tears. She looked at the boy, the child who was supposed to be a waste of air, and saw the future of their people. A future where a child's worth wasn't a calculation of genes, but a promise of potential. Thelonius looked at his mate, his voice dropping to a low, intimate rumble. "They said I bought a dying baby in the market that day." The merchants whispered that the giant king had finally lost his mind, trading gold for a ghost. But as I hold him now, I realize the truth. He pressed a kiss to Eleanora's temple. "I didn't buy a baby. I bought a future. He gave me a reason to be a king, and you gave me a reason to be a man." The camera pans back, the garden blurring into a soft focus as the sunlight catches a glint of silver at Eleanora's throat. The cracked locket she had tried to sell for a loaf of bread was no longer broken. It had been repaired with veins of pure gold, the cracks now beautiful scars that told the story of a journey from the mud to the stars. The masquerade was over. The North Star had found its place in the sky. Thank you for following Eleanora's journey from the shadows to the throne. If you believe that no one is truly defective, and that justice always finds a way, please let us know in the comments.